The day she walked into the lawyer's office, the rain followed her like it had been waiting for permission. It streaked down the glass walls in thin, trembling lines, blurring the city outside into something distant and unimportant. Her hands were steady, almost unnervingly so, as she placed the folder on the table. Inside it were the last papers tying her to the man she once loved. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head, telling herself that she would not cry, that she would not hesitate. This was the end, and she was ready, or at least she thought she was. He arrived late, as he often did, his hair slightly damp, his coat half-buttoned, eyes distracted as if his mind were still somewhere else. He offered a polite nod, nothing more. No warmth, no anger, just the empty civility of two people who had already said everything painful there was to say. He sat across from her, opened his briefcase, and reached for a pen. That was when his eyes fell to her belly. That was when his hand froze in midair, and the pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable, sensing that something far larger than legal paperwork was unfolding in front of him. Her ex-husband stared, eyes wide, breath shallow, as if the air had suddenly been sucked from the room. 7 months pregnant. There was no mistaking it now. The loose coat she wore couldn't hide it anymore, not sitting down, not this close. His voice, when it finally came, barely sounded like his own.
"You're pregnant."
She nodded once, just once, not defiant, not apologetic, simply factual.
"Yes."
The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken questions, accusations, memories. Ryu. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face, trying to piece together a reality he clearly had not been prepared for. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. And there it was, the first crack in his controlled, distant demeanor. She let out a slow breath, one she felt like she'd been holding for months. "Not because you didn't ask, because you left. Because when I tried to talk, you said you were done listening." The lawyer quietly suggested rescheduling, sensing that this was no longer a routine divorce meeting. But she shook her head. "No, let's finish this." Her voice trembled just slightly, enough to reveal the storm beneath her calm surface. Their story hadn't started like this. Once they had been two people who laughed easily together. Once they believed love alone was enough. They met in a small cafe where she worked part-time while finishing her studies. He was ambitious, charming in a quiet way, the kind of man who listened intently and made you feel like your words mattered. They married young, fueled by dreams and promises, convinced they would grow together. For a while they did, but life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. His career demanded more time, more energy, more of him than he had anticipated. Late nights turned into missed dinners turned into missed anniversaries. She tried to be patient, telling herself that this was temporary, that sacrifices were necessary. She supported him, encouraged him, stood by him when things were hard. But slowly, invisibly, the distance grew. When she began to feel lonely, she tried to tell him. When she felt unseen, she tried to explain. But he was always tired, always distracted, always promising that things would get better as soon. Soon never came. Conversations turned into arguments. Arguments turned into silence. And in that silence, both of them felt abandoned, each believing the other had already given up. The night everything finally broke, it wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet confession from him that he didn't know if he was still happy, that he felt trapped, that maybe they had rushed into something they weren't ready for. Her world collapsed in that moment, not with noise, but with a deep, aching emptiness. She asked if he wanted to try counseling. He said he needed space. A week later, he moved out. She discovered she was pregnant shortly after he left. The test trembled in her hand as the result appeared undeniable. A mix of fear, disbelief, and a fragile spark of hope rushed through her all at once. She called him, heart pounding, ready to tell him everything. But when he answered, his voice was cold, distant. He said he had already contacted a lawyer. He said he wanted a clean break. The words lodged in her throat, heavy and painful. She didn't tell him. She couldn't. Not then. The months that followed were the hardest of her life. Pregnancy alone is challenging enough, but doing it while navigating heartbreak and uncertainty tested her in ways she never imagined. She faced mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible. Nights when the weight of her thoughts was heavier than her growing belly. She worried constantly about money, about the future, about whether she was strong enough to raise a child on her own. There were moments she almost called him, moments when the baby kicked and she instinctively reached for her phone, wanting to share the miracle, the life growing inside her. But pride, pain, and fear held her back. She didn't want him to feel obligated. She didn't want her child to be the reason someone stayed out of guilt instead of love. She found strength in unexpected places. Her mother, who moved in with her for a while, cooking meals and quietly holding her hand during sleepless nights. Friends who showed up without being asked. A doctor who listened patiently to her fears and reassured her that she was doing just fine. Slowly, she began to believe it. By the time she decided to finalize the divorce, she had made peace with the idea of moving forward alone. The papers were a formality, a way to close a chapter that had already ended. She didn't plan to reveal the pregnancy. Not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't see the point anymore. This was her life now, and yet there he was, staring at her belly like he was seeing a ghost. Back in the lawyer's office, emotions finally spilled over. He stood up, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. "Is it mine?" The question cut deep, sharper than she expected. She met his eyes, hurt flashing across her face. "Yes, of course it is." He stopped pacing, guilt flooding his expression. Memories rushed back to him, the nights they spent together before everything fell apart, the plans they once made about starting a family someday. He sank back into his chair, voice breaking. "I didn't know. I swear, if I had known..." "You would have stayed?" she asked softly. "Or you would have resented me for it?" He had no answer. The truth was painful, and it sat heavily between them. They talked for hours that day, not as husband and wife, not even as enemies, but as two people finally being honest with each other. He admitted how lost he had felt, how afraid he was of failing, of not being enough. She admitted how invisible she had felt, how deeply his absence had wounded her. Tears were shed, apologies whispered, regrets laid bare. The divorce was postponed. What followed was not a fairy tale reunion, but something far more real and complicated. They didn't rush back into each other's arms. Trust, once broken, does not magically repair itself. They agreed to take things one step at a time, focusing first on the child they were about to bring into the world. He attended doctor's appointments, awkward at first, unsure of his place. He read parenting books late into the night, overwhelmed but determined. She watched him cautiously, guarding her heart, but slowly allowing him back into her life. There were setbacks, arguments, moments of doubt, flashes of old wounds reopening. But there were also small victories, shared laughter, quiet conversations. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to listen to each other at last. The real challenge came not from the past, but from the future. Could they forgive each other? Could they build something new from the ruins of what they had destroyed? There were days she considered walking away again, afraid of being hurt twice. There were days he questioned whether he deserved a second chance. When the baby was born, everything changed. Holding that tiny life in his arms, he understood the weight of his choices in a way he never had before. He cried openly, unashamed, whispering promises he intended to keep. She watched him, heart full and terrified all at once. Love, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about responsibility, about showing up even when it was hard. They didn't remarry immediately. They took their time. They went to counseling. They learned how to argue without tearing each other apart. They learned how to support without smothering. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt. Years later, she would look back on the day she went to finalize the divorce as the day everything changed. Not because the pain disappeared, but because the truth finally came into the light. Because two broken people chose to face their mistakes instead of running from them. Their story was never about avoiding hardship. It was about confronting it. About understanding that love is not just a feeling, but a choice made again and again, especially when it's uncomfortable. And in the end, that choice, born out of honesty, courage, and forgiveness, became the foundation of a family stronger than either of them had ever imagined. Sometimes the moment you think everything is over is actually the moment when life asks you to begin again, not with illusions, but with truth. The months after the baby's birth were both beautiful and brutally honest. Sleep became a luxury, emotions stayed close to the surface, and every small decision carried the weight of their fragile new beginning. They were no longer just two people trying to fix a broken marriage. They were parents learning how to care for a tiny human who depended on them completely. The baby's cries at night forced them into the same room, the same space, the same reality. Sometimes they moved around each other awkwardly, afraid to say the wrong thing. Other times, exhaustion stripped away their defenses, and they spoke with a raw honesty they had never allowed before. He struggled deeply with guilt. Every time he looked at the baby, he was reminded of the months he had missed, the pain she had carried alone. He tried to make up for it by doing everything, changing diapers, cooking meals, taking late-night shifts, but she could sense that he was punishing himself rather than truly healing. One night, after an argument over something small and meaningless, she finally said what had been building inside her. She told him she didn't need perfection or repayment. She needed presence. She needed consistency. She needed him to forgive himself if they were ever going to move forward. That conversation changed something in him. Slowly, he began to understand that love wasn't proven through grand gestures or constant apologies, but through showing up every day, even when it was uncomfortable. He started therapy on his own, confronting his fear of failure and his habit of running when things felt overwhelming. She continued her own journey too, learning how to release the anger she had carried for so long, realizing that holding on to it was quietly draining the joy from her present. There were setbacks. Old arguments resurfaced, sometimes sharper than before, because now there was so much more at stake. She worried about trusting him again, afraid that one day he would decide it was all too much and leave. He worried that no matter what he did, he would never fully earn back her faith. These fears sat between them during quiet moments, unspoken but heavy. Yet instead of letting those fears push them apart, they began to talk about them openly. Slowly, painfully, they learned how to listen without interrupting, how to validate each other without immediately defending themselves. As the baby grew, so did they. First, smiles turned into laughter, and laughter softened the edges of their past. Watching him read bedtime stories, his voice gentle and unsure at first, then confident, stirred something deep inside her. Watching her balance motherhood with quiet strength made him see her in a new light, not just as the woman he once loved, but as someone resilient, capable, and fiercely protective of her heart. One evening, long after the baby had fallen asleep, they sat together on the couch in the dim glow of a lamp. The house was finally quiet. He reached for her hand, hesitating, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Instead, she let her fingers rest against his, still cautious but no longer closed. He didn't ask for forgiveness that night. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply said, "Thank you for not giving up on life, for choosing honesty, for allowing him to grow." Tears filled her eyes, not because of sadness, but because for the first time, his words felt grounded in change, not regret. Their path forward wasn't about erasing the past. It was about carrying it wisely. They agreed that even if they failed again as a couple, they would succeed as parents. That promise removed the pressure and allowed space for something real to grow. Love returned quietly, not as fireworks, but as a steady warmth. Shared responsibilities turned into shared dreams. They began to imagine a future again, not perfect, but honest. Years later, when their child was old enough to ask questions, they told the story gently, not as a tale of blame, but as one of growth. They spoke about mistakes, about fear, about how people sometimes break, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to carry what they feel. They taught their child that love is not proven by never falling apart, but by choosing to rebuild with humility and courage. Looking back, she realized that the day she came to finalize the divorce was never truly about ending a marriage. It was about confronting the truth. And the truth, once spoken, had given them the chance to become something stronger than they were before. Not because everything worked out easily, but because they finally chose to face life together, fully awake, fully responsible, and fully present. Sometimes life doesn't save us from our breaking points. Sometimes it meets us there and asks us a harder question. What are you willing to become now? Time has a quiet way of revealing whether change is real or just a promise spoken in fear. For them, it revealed itself in ordinary days, not in dramatic moments or grand declarations, but in the steady rhythm of life they were building together. Mornings filled with small routines, shared responsibilities, and conversations that no longer felt like walking through a minefield. Trust didn't return all at once. It came back in fragments, earned through consistency, through actions repeated long enough to become believable. Their child became the mirror that reflected everything they were becoming, in the way he knelt to tie tiny shoes before work, in the way she paused to watch them together, still surprised by how far they had come. Parenthood forced them to confront parts of themselves they had once avoided. He learned that strength was not control, but patience. She learned that vulnerability did not always lead to abandonment. Slowly, fear loosened its grip. Yet life did not suddenly become easy. Financial pressures returned when his company downsized and his hours were cut. Old anxiety resurfaced, threatening to pull him back into withdrawal. The difference this time was that he didn't hide it. He spoke. He admitted he was scared. She listened even when her own fear whispered that this was the beginning of the end. Instead of turning away, they faced the uncertainty together. She picked up extra work. He took temporary jobs. They adjusted without resentment, reminding each other that survival was something they had already learned. One night during a power outage caused by a storm, they sat on the floor with their child between them, candles flickering against the walls. The simplicity of the moment struck her. Years ago, this kind of uncertainty would have torn them apart. Now, it held them closer. She realized then that what they had built was not fragile anymore. It was flexible. It could bend without breaking. As their child grew older, questions became more complex. Why did they live together before getting married again? Why were there pictures of two separate homes in old albums? They answered honestly, choosing truth over comfort. They explained that love sometimes gets lost, and finding it again requires courage. Their child listened, absorbing not just words, but the way they spoke to each other with respect without bitterness. That, more than anything, felt like success. There came a day when he suggested they move to a slightly bigger place, not as an escape, not as a reset, but as a natural next step. She hesitated, feeling echoes of the past. This time he didn't push. He waited. He let her decide at her own pace. When she finally said yes, it wasn't fear that filled her chest. It was confidence. The move symbolized growth, not avoidance. In the new home, surrounded by unpacked boxes and unfamiliar walls, they created fresh memories. Late-night laughter while assembling furniture. Small disagreements solved without cruelty. Shared silence that felt safe instead of heavy. One evening, after their child had fallen asleep in a room that finally felt like his own, he stood in the doorway, watching them breathe, and felt something settle inside him. This was what staying looked like. He didn't propose right away. He understood now that commitment was not a single question, but a continuous practice. When he finally did ask, it was quiet and unplanned. No audience, no performance, no performance. Just the two of them at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around warm cups of tea. He told her he wasn't asking her to forget the past, only to choose the future with him. She said yes, not because she needed him, but because she trusted them. Their remarriage was simple. A small ceremony with close family, their child proudly walking between them. There were no illusions of perfection, only promises rooted in honesty. They vowed to speak even when it was hard, to listen even when it hurt, to stay present even when running felt easier. The words carried weight because they had been tested by reality. Years later, when they faced another challenge, a health scare that forced them to confront mortality, they met it with the same steadiness. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled them. They had learned that life could shift without warning, and that love was less about control and more about partnership. Sitting in a hospital waiting room once again, she squeezed his hand and realized how different this moment felt from the past. They were no longer strangers facing crisis alone. They were a team. In the quiet of an ordinary evening long after, she watched him help their child with homework, patience etched into every movement. The memory of that lawyer's office felt like a lifetime ago. What once seemed like an ending had been the beginning of something far deeper than she ever imagined. Not a perfect love story, but a resilient one. Understood now that relationships don't survive because people never break. They survive because broken people choose responsibility over escape. Because they learn that love is not proven by intensity, but by endurance. And in choosing each other, day after day, through fear, forgiveness, and growth, they found something stronger than the version of love they once lost.